Alrighty, so got a load of stuff to catch up on here. So, what exactly caused the Spanish American War? Well, it's actually a gradual series of events that kind of escalate. The beginning of the war is basically, or the beginning of the stages that escalate to the war, is the sinking of the Maine, which was in February. In March, there is a Senate committee sent to investigate and inspect the conditions in Cuba. The committee is headed by a Vermont senator named Redfield Proctor. And his visit is really to sort of see how accurate the accounts that the Americans are getting in the newspapers are about what really is going on. So the long and the short of it is that while now realize at this point in time in March, the concentration camps have been officially disbanded for a month. Conditions in Cuba were so horrible. And Proctor's conclusion is that the Spanish occupation of Cuba is causing the physical and mental harm to the Cuban people, which is going to be bad for America. The Cubans are in no condition really to provide stable work or to be a good labor force. Proctor's visit and his conclusions really get the businesses of America to support the idea of war, largely because of the impact that the Spanish treatment of the Cubans is going to have on America's economy. In April, things are not getting any better. McKinley asks Congress to prepare for the possibility of war breaking out. In preparation, the Congress passes a resolution called the Teller Amendment. And the Teller Amendment states that the only reason that the United States is getting itself involved in the situation in the Caribbean is to free Cuba from Spain and to set up a peaceful transition of Spain leaving the Western Hemisphere. We are not interested in keeping Cuba. Now, please keep in mind that this only applies to Cuba, which we'll see is kind of important a little bit later. Things deteriorate, and on the 22nd of April, the United States Navy officially blockades Havana Harbor, the largest port in Cuba. The blockade of the harbor, which prevents Spanish ships from coming in or going out of the harbor, results in Spain declaring war on the United States. The U.S. responds by declaring war too. So now realize here, we have met every single condition that McKinley had set up in his inaugural address regarding potential conflicts. We are not going to war to take over Cuba. We are trying to help free it to protect American business interests, and the Spanish actually declared war on us, even though we kind of forced them into it with the blockade, but that's okay. So we basically achieved what it was that McKinley had said. We are not going to go to war, start a war, or go to war to gain territory. We're only going to defend ourselves, which, this kind of does. Now, the question, though, is with all this, is America really ready to fight a modern war? Well, yes and no. Money-wise, the answer is yes. When McKinley asked Congress to prepare for the possibility of a war, Congress set aside $50 million to fight the war. To give you a perspective, that $50 million is more money than the entire country of Spain made in a year. Spain couldn't compete economically with the United States in terms of fighting a war. We were more than prepared on that end. Number two, despite the fact that our Navy may not have had the big boy battleships that we wanted, and one of our few battleships got blowed up in, Havana Harbor, our Navy was much more updated, much more modern, and much more well-prepared than Spain's. The Spanish Pacific Fleet actually still had ships made of wood in it. This becomes a big issue. And we'll talk about the Atlantic Fleet a little bit later. They're not much better off. Now, so while we're prepared economically and Navy-wise, we are ready to go, the Army, well, not so much. So first of all, at the beginning of the Spanish-American War, in April of 1898, the entire U.S. Army was approximately 25,000 men. And those 25,000 men were scattered throughout the country fighting Indians. In contrast, the Spanish had over 200,000 soldiers in Cuba, not counting other Spanish soldiers available. Problem number 2. Spain had decided, to some degree, to invest in the purchase of the Maxim gun. I will post the little video explaining how the Maxim gun worked and what it did. By contrast, the U.S. decided to stick with Gatling guns, which are the hand-crank proto-machine guns, because we felt that the Maxim machine gun, which was actually a legit machine gun, would be too expensive and would cost more money in bullets than it would be worth. Now, there's also the issue of our rifles. The U.S. in the 1870s and early 1880s was still using the single-shot rifles from the Civil War. Most of Europe had upgraded to the Mauser-Gewehr 1898, the most modern, probably best rifle in the world. And the Mauser worked on a very simple principle. It was bolt action. So at the top of the gun, there was a bolt that you pulled backwards. The bolt opened up a chamber that went straight down. There was a strip of metal with 5 or 6 bullets on it that you simply pushed into the chamber, clicked the bolt back, and your gun was ready to shoot. As you shot, you pulled the bolt back, it ejected the cartridges automatically and reloaded the new ones. Very simple, straightforward design. The U.S. still had single-shot rifles. Now, we realized the need to update the rifles. The Mauser brothers, I think it's Wilhelm and Fritz, offered to sell America the Mauser rifle. We decided not to do that. Instead, we bought a rifle from a very obscure Norwegian gunsmith named Ole Krag. The Krag Jorgensen, a gorgeous weapon, bolt action, incredibly accurate, actually more accurate and with a better range than the Mauser had. The problem? The Krag Jorgensen, while it was bolt action and it held 6 shots, the Krag Jorgensen's shots had to be loaded individually, and they were loaded through a small flip door on the side of the gun, and the bullets went into the hand stock underneath the barrel, which meant that you had to load each bullet one at a time, and if somehow the gun got shot accidentally, the gun would explode. The more significant difference is that it took maybe 1 or 2 seconds to load a Mauser and have it fully loaded and ready to go. It took about 10 seconds to 15 seconds to load the Krag. That makes a big difference when you're fighting. Now, there's also the issue that the Army simply did not have the means to logistically handle going to Cuba. The Army was designed to defend America in case of invasion. The only offensive war we were looking at was possibly if we had to invade or fight Canada or Mexico, which are connected to us. The idea of actually crossing over and attacking somebody, having to go across the ocean or the sea, never really entered the minds of the Army. They didn't have any means of transporting stuff. So when the war broke out, the boats couldn't handle bringing over the horses or the heavy artillery for the most part. And this became a problem. The U.S. Army actually had to hire private boats to bring over men and equipment to Cuba, which was a slow process that meant that not everything was actually brought over when it needed to be. Additionally, American soldiers were wearing heavy wool uniforms, blue uniforms, designed to fight in the Great Plains during the winter months. We were headed to fight in a tropical jungle in the summer. It was not a good combination. Now, the strategy that the Americans are going to undertake is very straightforward. They are going to, let me go back over here real quick and get up a map for you here real quick. So here's a map of Cuba, okay? The American strategy is we've already blockaded Havana. We are going to go from Miami and land in Guantanamo, and we are going to land west of Santiago as well. And the U.S. Army is going to go from here to Santiago and link up with the Marines, surround Santiago on the land, while the U.S. Navy blockades Santiago from the sea. And then we will simply force them to surrender. Very simple, straightforward strategy. Okay? Doesn't quite work out that easily, which we'll talk about in a moment. But we're going to take a brief pause and an aside. We're going to talk about Teddy Roosevelt. Now, unlike modern politicians who, are free to declare or send, soldiers off to die or spend loads of money fighting wars by proxy, essentially having other people fight for us, that's not who Teddy was. Remember, Teddy Roosevelt was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, and he had been a big supporter of the idea of going to war with Spain, a big rah-rah war guy. When the war broke out, Roosevelt actually resigned his position in the executive department as the second highest ranking officer in the Department of the Navy and joined the Army. Not only did he join the Army, he created a volunteer Army Corps that was going to be made up of personally hand-selected friends and connections who were all going to go and fight on behalf of the United States. Now, why was this? Well, let's recall a couple of things about Teddy. Teddy was a millionaire from New York. His family was incredibly wealthy. When Teddy had been a very young child, he had a severe, almost fatal form of asthma, to the point where literally his parents, for the first few years of his life, thought he was going to die every day. And as a child, at one point in time, Teddy's dad pulled him aside and said, "Look, son, nature hates you and wants to kill you. So you have two choices. You can let nature win and you'll die. Or you can decide that you want to live and you fight nature. Which do you want to do?" And Roosevelt's like, "I want to live, Dad." And so Teddy Roosevelt dedicated himself to a physical fitness regime that was basically unheard of in the day. And by the time he got to college, he was a beast of a human being. It is safe to say he was one of the strongest men in America. And I'm not talking about like bodybuilder looking guy. He's like a power lifter strong. He may not have the build where it looks like he's, some kind of monster huge dude, but he could easily outfight, outlift, outrun, outdo anything of virtually everybody else around him. There was no manly activity that Teddy was not engaged in. Boxing, wrestling, martial arts, which was like literally unheard of back in the day. He's one of the first Americans to take up jiu-jitsu. He was involved in football, in crew, which is competitive rowing in a boat. Anything physical and manly, Teddy was into it. Now, Teddy idolized his dad, but there was one thing his dad did that Teddy could never get around, and that was that during the Civil War, Dad, who was from a wealthy millionaire family, had bought his way out of military service. And Teddy always felt that that was a disgrace to the Roosevelt family. And so, when the opportunity came up to actually get involved in a war, Teddy decided he was going to do that. Now, Teddy's life was also kind of filled with tragedy. After graduating from college, Teddy had fallen in love with a girl in college, as is wont to happen, got married, and settled into a life of being a successful politician. Until one fateful day when a double tragedy struck Teddy personally. On the exact same day, in the exact same house, His wife died giving birth to their daughter Alice, and his mom died in a separate room. Teddy was completely devastated, to the point that looking at his daughter, he just kept seeing his dead wife. He couldn't handle it. So he basically went into his sister one day and said, I can't do this. You handle it. Dumped off his kid, and for 2 years disappeared. For those 2 years, he went out to the Wyoming, Dakota area and became a cowboy. So he was a cowboy who was, Ivy League University educated, wearing like Coke bottle glasses and talking with a vocabulary beyond the means of most Americans. And he also had a high, squeaky voice, which didn't help, considering the fact that he was just like a monster of a human being. But he met a lot of people out there. And so when the war broke out, he contacted these people. And the 1st Volunteer Cavalry Corps of the United States Army, better known as the Rough Riders, was made up of a motley assortment of Ivy League graduates, doctors, lawyers, engineers, teachers, professional men who had graduated from Harvard, Princeton, Brown, Yale, cowboys, including, by the way, my great-great-grandfather, who was a U.S. Marshal that Teddy met and invited him to join, criminals. Because if you're going to go to a war, why not, give guns to people who are already in jail and say you want to go kill people? I'm like, yeah, I'll go do that. And a group of people known as the Buffalo Soldiers. The Buffalo Soldiers were the United States Army's all African American corps. The Rough Riders are the first fully integrated U.S. Army platoon or Army Corps in history. They all got along with each other. Nobody made any differences or distinguishings about race, political beliefs, upbringing, wealth, anything like that. Didn't matter. They're all in it together. Now, they're supposed to be a cavalry corps. That means they're supposed to fight on horseback. The problem is that they could only bring the officers' horses over because they didn't have any way to get them over. And because they were supposed to be cavalry soldiers, they were armed with cavalry rifles, short-range repeating rifles that were great for horseback fighting, but not necessarily for ground fighting. But they kind of had to make do with what they had. Okay, so this is the end of part 1 of the notes. I'll get the second note dump up in a little bit. Peace and love.